Beoth Sunday, ik hotste Kevin. I'm here joined with the delightful Jennifer Brooks, who is very well read and a learned booktuber who has a master's in library science. Her channel is full of great content where you can immerse yourself into the realm of literature. Today's talk will be primarily on King Alfred of Wessex. Westhill Hall, and welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Okay, so for those of you who are new to Jennifer Brooks and all that, so for those of you who are completely a neophyte, so to speak, can you tell us a bit about what your channel is about? And because I said literature, but like, can you go a little more in depth in that, please?
So my channel is mostly reading what I'm currently reading, and I read all over the place. So I read classics and fantasy, but also nonfiction history. So my channel also has a history bent. So I try to do a lot in a little bit of time.
Fantastic. Yes, and okay, so as Jennifer and I discussed, that King Alfred is our main subject here, and well, just to get the ball rolling on Alfred, like, what do you like about Alfred? Why Alfred? Why good old Alfie?
I just really respect his integrity. And I also think it's fascinating to read about people who had chronic illness or chronic pain in the past and how they had to deal with it. And I don't think they've ever said for sure what Alfred struggled with, but he had some kind of stomach disease that really would have affected his diet. And I just think it's interesting the resolve that he had to continue to go into battle and rule a country when you're in that amount of pain all the time. So I think that's really what attracted me to him early on. But I also think he had a real emphasis on education, which I think is fascinating, particularly in the medieval period. That was often the purview of the church. So it's interesting to see a ruler that got so invested in that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because Alfred had a lot of things going on. He had Vikings to deal with, and they were a threat to his kingdom, and what to say of the other kingdoms adjacent to him. And yeah, it's quite a stressful time. But the thing is, like, as much as King Alfred is admirable, whatnot, it's funny that people refer to him as like an English king, but he's a West Saxon, and but this anachronism, so to speak, it's not something old. It's actually, you see it actually in a Middle English text, actually, where Alfred is referred to as England darling, something like that. Well, literally translate that England's darling, but darling of itself, that was the way you'd say my favorite. So kind of similar to German Liebling. So yeah, to refer to something's favorite. And the thing is, I remember doing 2 videos on this, regarding the education and whatnot, because with his reforms, or what sort of inspired him to how can I word this, like, to promote education, because previous to Alfred, the kingdom of Northumbria was well known for its literature. It was like it was like a powerhouse for like literature, and because Christianity came over there quite. I don't know the exact dates, but like I knew that the Irish came there, something to the effect of that. My history on that is very muddy, so to speak. And as well as Mercia had a lot of literary strength, so to speak. And in fact, when Alfred, would how can I word this? Realize what was going on in like the state of education, how like, oh, you have all this wisdom, and it's not even like written down or what have you, and like or that he had help. He had help from Mercia. He had help from even a gentleman named John from Old Saxony. So he had to really scour the land, so to speak, to get to really educate his people. But it's what I find really fascinating of itself that him being a West Saxon, he always referred to the language as Englisc.
Yeah.
And like, hang on here, like my not issue, but like it's like I question his sincerity. Is he like? But I have to give it to him that King Alfred of himself, he translated many, or well, I mean, it's quite debatable whether he translated the literature himself from Latin into Old English. Um, he translated Boethius's Consolation of the Soul, and I found like, oh my god, that's like a philosophical work, and I found from a phonological forgive me, from a philologist point of view, and somebody studying the language. I mean, this is wonderful. Like to if you want to speak about higher things, I mean, you learn from that. Apart from the homilies from Alfred of Eald, and then later at a late West Saxon writer, Wolfstan is another one.
Yeah.
And but really from his translation of Boethius, among other translations, is quite good for learning the language.
And that's interesting because that was like a massively popular book in the medieval period, but it's not one we hear much of today. Like it's not one that really survived from ancient times, but that was the medieval bestseller, The Consolation of Philosophy.
Yes.
And it might have been, I think it's been proven that in some way, like Alfred translating that into English helped promote it a bit more in the British Isles and the UK islands.
Yeah, I imagine so, because if I may, I believe I have his preface of pastoral care. Well, that's another thing that was translated as well. So let me just so let me try to find the exact quote here. Yeah, that essentially that there was a lot of decay and let me just okay. I'm just looking here. How essentially, hang on, let me just paste this in the chat as well. So it's not just me looking at it, Wait, how do I? Okay. Hang on, I'll figure this out. Private chat. There we go.
I started to say I'm going to ask a stupid question. Are we in private chat? We are.
I believe so on Steam.
Yeah, I think that's just us.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. For those of you who just found this or what have you, this is my first time doing this, so please forgive me for any mess ups or this or that. So I have. Do you have it now, Jennifer?
I do.
Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, it's yeah. So in the second paragraph here, and I'll just how about this? How about I read the Old English, and then Jennifer, you can read the translation. How does that sound?
Awesome.
Fantastic. All right, sweet the gold. Okay, so second paragraph. Ik thought this al je munde, thought je munde ik hoe ik je zag temte het alle voor hergod waren aan voor barnen en hoe thought kerkjan jond al Anglican stoden maatman en bogen je vulde und ek Michael Menio godes Theo and tha Swede lutle fjorme thara boka wiston. For the hier nan wuchte on jetan mechten for the hier neron on hier agen jethure ritten Svelke hier kwaden ure ealdran Thought stora ärade hildon, he luverdon wisdom, and thorkethone he bejaton wellan and us levdon. Hermon my yet yesion here swat. Quay him ne kunnon after the spirian. And for them we have nu either for leten ye thone wellan ye thone wisdom. For them we noldan to them spore mid ure modem on lutan.
Then in modern English, when I considered all this, I remembered also how I saw, before it had been all ravaged and burnt, how the churches throughout the whole of England stood filled with treasures and books, and there was also a great multitude of God's servants, but they had very little knowledge of the books, for they could not understand anything of them, because they were not written in their own language. As if they had said, "Our forefathers, who formerly held these places, loved wisdom, and through it they obtained wealth and bequeathed it to us. In this we can still see their tracks, but we cannot follow them, and therefore we have lost both the wealth and the wisdom, because we would not incline our hearts after their example."
Beautiful. Yeah, that's quite yeah, if you're a prodigy scholar at that time, it would be a hellish condition, like, I want to be a learned person, but how can I when when all this wisdom is like, not written down. But what this also says to me is that because we've got to bear in mind the not supremacy, prestige, there we go, that Latin had, because Latin, being the language of the church, was like deemed superior in some ways, because I remember reading, this is an old High German, well, it's in Latin, but I forget the name of the Frank in question, but he was complaining about translating like the Bible into German or Frankish, because like, this language doesn't have it has a smattering of the teeth. I think it's referring to that TS sound in German, the Z, that sound, and it doesn't have the smoothness of Latin. So I'm assuming he's referring to the guttural sounds like and potentially the voice with the fricative. But yeah, so Latin was definitely the language of communication. It was the lack of a better term, lingua franca, but then again, the word lingua franca is literally Latin for the Frankish language, but that's a small side. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on this paragraph?
It is really beautiful. And that's really interesting too, when you think about Alfred and kind of the push for stuff to be written in the vernacular or in your local language. That was a really big argument throughout the entire medieval period. So it's interesting when I think about it. I think most of the time this happened in places like Italy, and even in France, they made the push to start writing in true Italian or French in the 1400s. And Alfred was trying to do this in the 800s. So he was kind of a little bit ahead of his time in that regard. But it seems like after him, not very much was written in English. Is that right? Is that what you found? There's still a lot of like Latin that is being written at the time.
Well, okay, at the time of the Anglo-Saxon period, there was obviously Latin being written down, lots of poetry as well. Afterwards, I mean, I'm not too expert on the after the Anglo-Saxon period, but definitely writing became more prevalent. I would assume so, because we have the body of literature for Middle English is like vast, with the Canterbury Tales and many other texts that are out there. But yeah, it's. Could you repeat your question again? Because I got slightly distracted with something.
No, it's okay. I was actually, this actually leads me into one of my main questions that I have for you. Is that I notice when I read this stuff, this is from the time before the printing press, And so there's not a lot of standardized spelling before the printing press. Do you struggle to find what you would say is like a standardized text of Old English at all? Or does that even factor into an equation for you?
The thing is with Old English and the varieties of it, to really understand Old English, I mean, Old English of itself is, in my view, a rather, I mean, it's a good term for laymen, but when you really analyze the great variety of it, it's really a group of dialects. I mean, I have this fringe term that I like to use, inspired by Old High German. And as a small aside, Old High German is actually a group of dialects of Old Bavarian, Old Alemannic, and you got the Old High Franconian or High Frankish dialects. And you got East, you got Rhine, and then you got Middle. But just trying to drawing from that, into the British Isles, because when we say Old English, this is a term that was like, it was popular. Like, how can I word it? I remember reading about it. It was done, I think, sometime. I could be wrong on this, but like, I remember reading that it was in the 16th century, something like that. The term Old English was applied to, or was it Anglo-Saxon? I'm not too sure, one or the other. But like, the idea was to make the language, fashionable. Well, actually, sorry, forgive me. I believe it was Anglo-Saxon, but Old English, the term itself, is a term coined by Henry Sweet, very well known Anglo-Saxonist, so to speak, or someone who wrote a lot of grammar books and whatnot on language, philologist in one way of. I mean, he's known for many things, but definitely writing on like writing textbooks for the language. And a lot can be said about this, because learning from Joseph Wright, one of my favorite, my main guy for Old English pronunciation. For those of you who don't know Joseph Wright, he was Tolkien's tutor for Gothic, and he was also the man behind the dialect dictionary of English dialect dictionary of England. So with him, the way he describes dialects, that there's no one dialect that's uniform. It's rather a group of subdialects. So, like, for example, when you look at Mercian literature, you're seeing features from Kentish. You're seeing features from West Saxon. You have some, dare I say, interference or influence, because they're all speaking more or less, dare I say, the same language, but there are varieties. Like, for example, I believe in the Rushmore manuscript of the Gospels, like in the latter half of it, you see some like Northumbrian features. Like, for example, like you'd see like och for but. Normally you see och, but even among writers, because you didn't have a printing press, you really had to you were reliant on these monks and scribes that you had, that copied a lot of material, like from one dialect into another, so to speak. And like all the poetry that we have of Anglo-Saxon literature, it's not original West Saxon material. In fact, it's Anglian. And for those who are not familiar with Anglian, in Anglo-Saxon literature, Anglian refers to literature from Mercia and Northumbria. And I guess for Alfred to uplift his people, uplift his kingdom, and make his kingdom look sort of, I don't know, good, is
better
to get
than the others.
Yes, better than the others, is to have that Englisc prestige, I would say. Like, oh yeah, we speak English too. Despite the fact that we're West Saxons, but yeah, we so a lot of material was translated. Translate is a big word of itself, but because thing is, when it comes to language labeling, especially language and dialect and whatnot, then you're slightly getting into politics, because, like, I'll give you a small example. From a linguistic point of view, you could say that, oh yeah, Danish, Norwegian and Swedish, yeah, they're all like dialects of each other. But you say that to any of the speakers, they would be very upset with you. No, but objectively speaking, from a linguistic point of view, they all share features. They all Old Northumbrian, Old Mercian, Old Kentish, Old West Saxon, and even with West Saxon. Had the Norman invasion never happened, or King, what's his name, Harold. Anyway, had he won the Battle of Hastings, you would have what I believe is this Winchester standard or something like that, and
Yeah.
so yeah, and had that evolved, what would, the big question is, oh Kevin, what would it look like today? It would be take a mix of, imagine West Frisian, which by the way is the closest language to English, Low German or Plattdeutsch, and Danish. So something, it would be a mixture of those three, and yeah, that's how you could, because it's only in the later period where you have like people like, I believe, Wolfstan, who Archbishop, I believe, who incorporated some Scandinavianisms, so to speak, into his writing. But yeah, I mean the dialects. But just to go further back to Alfred and really West Saxon, with West Saxon literature, it's divided into two periods. So in the time of Alfred, you have what is called early West Saxon. Most grammar books and primers, they base their proverbial standard on that, despite the fact that they also would contain like late West Saxon literature. So late West Saxon would be writers like Alfred of Ainsham. I'm probably mispronouncing that because I'm so used to Old English. And Wolfstein is a late writer. Trying to think of others, but yeah. But Beowulf, what I can say about that, I believe that's in late West Saxon.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that,
I started to say, yeah, that's what it. I think that's what it was dated to.
yeah, and but the thing is, with these West Saxon texts, they still like have like, because Alfred had Anglian helpers or English helpers, so to speak. They They're little Anglianisms. Like in the literature, for example, okay, so for example, the verb to fall in West Saxon would be like fallum, well, with the ea, whereas the Anglian, so to speak, would just be fallum. Yeah, yeah. So it's little nuances, and you kind of have to be a linguist to like to hear the differences and slight nuances. Like for those of you who are studying Old English quite seriously, to identify a West Saxon text would be the IE diphthong. That's a very signature feature of Old West Saxon, so to speak. So
That's fascinating.
yeah, I hope that answers your question at length.
It did. I wondered, just thinking like when you're trying to learn a language that's technically dead, it's so hard sometimes with stuff when there wasn't standardized spelling, and sometimes different texts pop up of the same text, I guess you would say, but
Yeah.
their way they're written is sometimes vastly different, because we came across that in Latin quite a bit, which is interesting because Latin was so standardized, but it went through a lot of changes in the medieval period. So I
Yeah.
figured it might be kind of, I don't know that it would be difficult, but I just wondered if that impacted you at all.
Well, sometimes it is sometimes it is difficult to discern, what the origin of this vowel or this diphthong or what have you, where from trying to piece of language together, historical language together, knowing what vowel came from what diphthong or this or that. That's why knowing a bit of Proto West Germanic or Proto Germanic is quite useful. And for those of you who don't know, Proto Germanic and Proto West Germanic, these are hypothetical languages. Hypothetical languages used by linguists to, how can I word it, to like these are the hypothetical ancestor of all these languages. So how you get Proto-Germanic, for example, you would compare all the data you have for all these historical languages, and then it'll lead you to the proto ancestor. When really it's to be quite honest about it, it's a really good educated guess, so to speak. And this is good for the like grammar wise, like, because thing is, Old English, what makes it very different from present English, that Old English has what is called the inflected case system. So the ending of a noun determines the function of the noun in question. Whether a noun is in the plural genitive, plural singular, and so these proto languages help us out, and to figure out how can I word this? I mean, to figure out the dialectal stuff. Let's say Old Kentish, Old Mercian, Old Northumbrian. That's quite difficult because the source material is very, very scant, and the thing is, when somebody gets into this sort of stuff, they can't think of it from the perspective of a modern, codified, standardized language. Like it's its own thing. Rather, when you go far back enough, it'll have features. It would have common features. Like if you were compare, let's say, Old English to Old Saxons, or Old Saxon, an Old High German dialect, you would find some features that are identical, or very similar. So that's what makes that's what helps in sort of in reconstructing, and like, as opposed to where the split was, so to speak. I hope that answers your question, because there's a lot to be said on it. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah. So, King Alfred. So he had a number of laws. Would that be something you'd like to dive in?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, because he. Because I remember doing a video on his laws, and he. Yeah, they seem quite. Because I remember. Hang on, let me try to. Okay, let me send you the link. Should have done this beforehand. Oh boy. Okay, so it's gonna be on Google Books, and so, ladies and gentlemen, the links that I'm sharing with Jennifer here will be posted down below as well for your viewing as well, for your linguistic time travel. Yeah, it's because I remember, like, off the fly, so to speak. I remember reading from Alfred's laws where, like, you're like essentially not allowed to like worship piles of stones or wells or this or that. Like a lot of it really calls back to like the Old Testament of the Bible, and so it's but I guess that was his way of consolidating his rule, in that but the one thing too is that, like, with Alfred, I mean, everyone says, oh yeah, he's the one that birthed the idea that, oh yeah, he wants to unite England. But I've yet to find like a source where it actually says, "I, King Alfred, ik Alfred Koning Wille." I don't know. I, Anlord would be united, but like, or whatever. Wanting to unite England. Have you, like,
Never.
in your reading, have you found anything that points to that?
No.
No.
That's what's so funny. No, I think there are often things where he said king of Anglo-Saxons, and
Yes.
sometimes he included the Jutes. Good for him, but he never said anything about uniting all of the kingdoms, and I think that's probably from later on in his reign, like when he was really getting into the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. By that point, the Danelaw had been established, so I'm sure he never once thought those people were coming back in. Probably not during his lifetime. So I don't know, but I think I have seen reference to like being king of the Anglo-Saxons, so to
Yes,
speak.
I've seen that
But he
too.
never said like uniting the kingdoms under one into one country.
Yeah, I
Not
think
like Athelstan, where you can see and stuff from Athelstan's time. He 100% said that's what he was going to do.
right. It's interesting. Because a lot of people and well, a lot of shows like to paint Alfred as like, the first person to put this idea forth, and yeah, that's how things were back then. Because as far as like the idea of what is a nation then as opposed to now, when we think of a nation, we think of like borders and this and that. I mean, yes, in the period you had like, so and so's land, but like if I were to say like, oh, I'm going to Gaul, be like I'm going to the okay, this is me translating already. Like I'm going to the Gauls, so to speak. It's like the people are the nation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like if I were to say, "Oh, I'm going to the nation of the Iroquois," for example. I'm going to the Iroquois, so that hints at okay, you're going to their land, wherever they are. So, yeah, a lot of people tend to like that's sort of the how can I word this, where you had the kings of peoples rather than kings of like borders, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And a lot of modern biographies of Alfred mention that exactly, that like we have a very different conception of what a
Yeah,
country is, and also just in terms of like a nation or being patriotic. That is not something that would have occurred to most people in the medieval period. You wouldn't have said like I'm English first and then I'm a wife or a husband or something like that. Your identity was a little bit more important to you than where you were from in the
like
medieval period, from what I've read. So that's kind of interesting.
I mean, you had clans, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
I'm representing my clan. You have my people. Um, anyway, yeah, because you had clans. So you like the idea that because even the Northumbrians and Mercians, they fought amongst each other, despite being Angles, what have you, or yeah, because you had at one point. I'm not too well versed on this, but the Mercian supremacy at one time,
Yeah.
where you had like people like I believe King Penda. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
he really. I was reading about him a few weeks ago and how like he could have he was how can I word it, like he was close to being called like the one to unite Britain, but he didn't. But he was so close. But I've also read that due to the last battles that he was in, he had a lot of abandonments, a lot of deserters, so to speak. So
Yeah.
yeah, but again, it's. But then again, fast forward, Athelstan is our uniter of the people and whatnot. So yeah. Um, anything else you want to say on Alfred, or anything of the Anglo-Saxon period, and extend this to the language itself, or anything like that?
We've hit a lot of what my questions were, what a lot of my points were. You like answered everything before I could say it. So you've actually exhausted my questions.
Yeah, because I have a habit of doing that because if I answer something too briefly, there I can already hear someone saying, "Oh, Kevin, uh, you know, um, tell us more," or what have you. But like, yeah, because thing is, with this period and with this sort of material, uh, there's no short answers. Like it has to be, and I like to be very thorough, like because this stuff is not very simple and whatnot. Because I mean, especially with the literature that's handed down to us. I mean, we're so lucky that this stuff survived.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, oh man, with Henry VIII and his dissolution of the
Yeah.
monasteries and whatnot, and how a lot of Anglo-Saxon texts were like were removed, or they were, or a lot of these manuscripts were recycled, repurposed for other things, and so, or in a much later period where you would have a lot of house fires. So Beowulf luckily survived, and we only have one manuscript of that epic of itself, and oh man, it's quite something else. And and also the labor involved, like to making these manuscripts. Like cow skin, and then you got to do all this very tedious labor and whatnot, and then you got to make sure that the scribe in question writes correctly, and then what to say, spell well, and then again, you can't say spell things, but like, because thing is, back then, I mean, it was more, you could say phonetic, but at the same time, Old English itself is not completely phonetic, because the
Yeah.
letter G has like what, top of my head, like what, four sounds, and so there are things that you kind of have to, like, if I randomly give you an Anglo-Saxon text, we would have like, in that alone, it'd be hard to really discern how to pronounce it when there were things back then that were just commonly known.
Yeah.
Right? Like for example, the word in English, a regime. Well, someone can look at that and think like this regime or something like that. When if that makes sense. Yeah, there. So to overcome this, so to speak, that's where looking at Middle English literature helps us to figure out phonological developments. Uh, you know, to get a good idea what sound was what. And it's funny because a lot of people have this weird assumption that, I mean, I used to fall into this assumption too, that you had this palatalized ch sound, like for
Yeah.
example, riche, when really, when we learn from Joseph Wright, that's not it's not really something that Joseph Wright agrees with, because the runic alphabet doesn't have a ch sound as a, and we got to think about, well, what led to the ch sound, and what we have is a palatalization where you would have a K, but with the either like sort of like a K, not KJ, well, a KY sort of sound, like a Kia or a Keel, if you will, and that allegedly, well, that's what Joseph Wright argues to be how what led to the ch sound in question. And, I hope I'm not boring you with this stuff.
No, this is interesting. Since
Okay,
I'm not into linguistics, like this is a whole new world to me.
whole new world. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah. It's very fascinating, in how words that we take for granted, and some words are with us that are like 1,000 years old. And in fact, father is from Yorkshire, and in Yorkshire they still use words that go back to thou and thee, like thou and thee, which is like pretty cool of itself. And because thing is, with standardization, that happened much later, I believe, with the Caxton press.
Yeah.
And
That sounds right.
yeah, and but they but there's some mix up where like the spelling does not go with how it sounds, and we lost Jennifer. Fantastic. We are now resumed due to a minor hiccup, and everything is all good once again. Okay, so I was basically talking about nerding out essentially about Old English, the phonological development, but that's a mouthful of itself, of the ch sound. Yeah, it's funny how people have some assumptions of how people spoke back then, and yeah. But is there anything in particular you want to dive in, like anything Anglo-Saxon at this point? So I mean, Jenny.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm sorry to keep pestering you with questions,
Oh, please, sure, please.
but I kind of have a pet time period within the Anglo-Saxon period. I think a lot of people think of the Anglo-Saxons and they're like, this is one and done. But it was from around 410, the Romans pulling out of Britain. We don't really know when the Anglo-Saxons came over, but that can be a whole different conversation, the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But up to 1066, that's like 600 years. So a lot was going on. And my pet time period is kind of Alfred's reign and a little bit before kind of the first Viking attack on Lindisfarne up to around Alfred's death. But I didn't know, do you have a pet time period? Like, do you prefer the later West Saxon language? Like, do you have a preference in terms of language? Do you prefer it earlier or later?
I prefer anything before the 7th century.
Wow, that's super early.
Because that's before Christianization.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested into pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon England. With how you have the genealogies, the kings claiming royal descent from Woden, which I found recently with I think it's Alverdi's Chronicon. It's in Latin, but like you find attestations of like names of Woden. I'm kind of giving away my future video. I just realized. All right, well, spoiler.
Yeah.
Names of like deities and I find that really cool, and how you can find with these genealogies, you can find the correlations with like Norse literature. And what I like as well is that even I believe with the later material, I mean, I don't know when exactly, maybe the 10th century, maybe the 900s, for the medicinal charms, like for example the famous 9 herbs charms where it mentions Woden slew a snake or something like that, and like into like 7 or 9 pieces or something like that. I'm it's funny, I should know because I've done quite a few videos on it.
And that has a Norse equivalent, doesn't it?
Sorry?
That has a Norse equivalent, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that's ringing a bell.
From what I know from the Norse literature, that we have Thor who slays, I think it's Jormungandr. I can't remember.
Yeah.
He slew some kind of serpent being or what have you, and it's really interesting to see Woden doing that as well. As well as from more of a linguistic, phonological, philological point of view. It's my first time saying this on this channel, but like I found one name that like really stood out to me. It's on a runic inscription of like, I think it's Olnswini, and this is really significant because this was I believe found in Northumbria, and this is like evidence of like continental angle, if that makes sense. And thing is, this like this is significant because this shows, because in Old High German names or continental names, well, really from the Franks Bavaria, southern. How can I word this? Anything south of the continental Saxons, you have this. Okay, I'm going to use a very linguistic term here. You have what is called invionic nasal. I forget the exact term. Okay, I'll give you one easy example. Okay, so in English, we have mouth from Old English muth, Old Saxon you have muth. Well, in Old High German you had something like mund or something like that. So you have that medial n, and um, you didn't. And but with Old Frisian, Old Saxon, and Old English, you didn't have this. But with this name Onswini, you have that relic N in Britain.
Yeah.
So this is like evidence that this was brought over from literally the Angles themselves. And it's funny because we don't have a lot of material on like continental Angle. The beat says, "Oh yeah, all the Angles they came to Britain," and from the Angles we get the East Anglians, we get the Mercians, we get and all the Northumbrians, or what have you. But like as far as attestation of their language, what did like and I would imagine if you go far back enough, it's nice to see evidence of like, okay, so you see some similarities. Yeah, because the thing is, if you go far back enough, these Germanic people spoke the same language. And in fact, here's a really cool thing I found out recently, and this is from reading Eduard Zievals's Old English Grammar. And for those of you who are not really aware, his grammar book does a great service to dialects. So if somebody really wants to dive into knowing the nuances, I would recommend that. Anyway, the point I want to get to is that for the conjugation of the verb to be, of saying you are in Old Northumbrian, and I believe in Old Mercian as well. One of the attestations, I believe, if I'm reading it correctly, you have thu ith. The significance of this is the same as Gothic.
Oh yeah.
And Gothic is what a language that attests back to what, the 4th, 3rd century. I'm not too. I know it's really ancient, and it's just really cool to see this ancient archaicism all the way to with these angles. Like that's how you can tell how old a Germanic language is. How similar. I mean, this could work in some instances, or what have you. But then someone could argue, well, maybe due to phonological circumstance that happened to look like the older form, whether it is actually a true relic from preserved relic. Well, that of itself is a discussion. But it's cool to see words that are identical, the Anglian words to the continental words, and what to say of the Gothic words, where like. So if somebody really wants to know what is Old English proper, well, we look to Old Mercian, we look to Old Northumbrian, and I have to say on the side as well that a lot of Old Northumbrian words look very similar to what we are familiar with today. Like one example would be sword, spelled the same way, but you pronounce it differently. And as an aside, for those who don't know, the Old Northumbrian is where we get Scots from, which is the other Anglic language in England, which excuse me, not Scotland. But that of itself has a lot of Scandinavianisms because they too had their Scandinavian invasions. But I'm not too well versed on that. But as far as and it's quite interesting how you have a lot of archaicisms that survive up there, especially their pronunciation today. I believe that the latest attestation of "ich" as a personal pronoun. I could be wrong on this. In the north, would be I believe 400, like 1400, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty late. I find that really cool. Where in the Middle English period, you went from you went okay. Just to give a very short history of the verb, the personal pronoun I. You went from ik to eek, it, each, and then later on to e in Middle English, small side. There are dialects today in Austria where they don't say ich, they say e as well. So in a way, they sound kind of Middle Englishy. So from Middle English e for I. What happened next? You had the great vowel shift. So e became I. Like for example, knief became knife, and all that. So things like that. Yeah. So it's just it goes to show that linguistics of itself is a whole new rabbit hole in the realm of language and literature and yeah. So I hope that
E is also what they say for I in Danish, I think. We used to say E.
E. Okay.
Mhm.
And I believe that's written J-E. No, J-E-G. Is that how you write it?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes. Okay, yeah. Because J's they struggle with. As
yeah,
I'm always asked by Danes, how do you spell your name? Is it with a Y or a J? A Y would be super cool, but no.
yeah,
I spell it with it's J is often wanders in for an I for them.
yeah. Because for J, like for a lot of languages, is a y sound. I mean, if I
Yeah.
were to read her name as if it were Old English, it would be Jennifer.
Yeah.
And how would I go? Well, Jennifer, the name of itself, I believe it's of Celtic origin.
It is. And it comes from Guinevere. I always use that as my claim to fame.
Okay.
I'm like,
Right.
I could be Guinevere.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Oh, Kevin is also a Celtic name,
Yeah.
allegedly from Old Irish. I would loosely translate it as "beloved born," something like that.
Yeah.
Something like I don't know. I mean, it's a nice name though, but yeah, like it's really it goes to show that every name and word has a story behind it. And well, just to go back to Alfred, I mean his name, well, Alfred, so literally elf council. So yeah, and that word red, the verb form redan, had two meanings back then. You had to read, as we know it today, but also it meant to advise, like you know.
Yeah.
And I believe in German, I could be wrong in this. I know they have a word that's very similar to this, but it means advice, like rat, maybe, or something like something to the effect of that. I could be wrong, but yeah, it just goes to show that how some words, what may be archaic to us as English speakers, is normal in another language. Like for example, if I were to go around and say maiden, you'd only really find that in literature or some dialects of English. But if I go to speak in German, Mädchen, that's like a common word. Yeah. So it's I mean I butchered the pronunciation, but anyway, but yeah, this goes to show that like languages have their own evolution, and and they have their own story. Yeah.
And
So,
the Anglo-Saxons were kind of into like what your name meant. So we
yeah.
still are to a certain extent, but they very much would like pick a name that they thought would go with their child going into a certain profession. So I think Alfred was probably meant to go into the church with his name, meaning kind of advice and stuff like that. He was the third or fourth son. So
Yeah.
he in no way should have made it to being
Yeah.
king, but
Yeah.
Viking invasions, killing off your family members, you're kind of the only one left.
Yeah. It's quite something. That reminds me how I remember reading. It's from a Norse text or something like that, where I can't pronounce it, like Flubok or something like that. Not so sure, but something to the effect of that. I remember reading somewhere where I think you have this in Iceland today, where like kids, where parents would name their kids after like pagan gods or what have you. Like the idea was to like, oh, so this child would have like a good life or what have you. Well, kind of similar how people today name their children after names from the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't think. Well, I mean, well, yeah, it's pretty interesting with self. But yeah, names back then were quite significant. Some names were like physical epithets, I'd
Yeah.
imagine. Like in much later history, Edward Longshanks, referring to his legs. But a lot of it was occupational. So Smith is an example of that. Um, Also, one's title, because the way it would work, as far as like, if I were to say King Alfred in Old English, it's actually the other way around, where it's Alfred Kuning. So it's only later that the title got switched around or what have you. But then again, that also reminds me of another point about Old English. It makes it a little different than present English. That well, actually, it's really after the loss of the inflected case system where word order became more prevalent, so to speak. Whereas in Old English, the order of words, I mean, yes, there is some room to play around with, but like you got to make sure that your inflected case system is intact. That it has to be coherent, because a way of looking at the evolution of, well, if I'd be so bold to say, really a devolution of Englisc into what we speak now. Because what do I mean by this is that, excuse me, that Old English was a not only an inflected language, but also had grammatical gender, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And as a small aside, we do have in the historical record of Alfred, no, not Alfred, Alfred's grammar, where he was teaching Latin, but like but the language of instruction is Old English.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah,
That's cool.
yeah. So like I like looking at it, because like it's like I'm learning from the time itself, and yeah, a lot of literature was translated from Latin, but oh man. Thing is, when I talk about this stuff, there's so many things that go through my mind, and like, oh man, it's just like, because I know that there are people out there, and I'm very pleased that you find all this stuff fascinating and whatnot. So like, oh my god. So yeah, a lot of so we have that for. You could argue that his text is like a proto grammar, which other grammars kind of use, so to speak, I would imagine, because the history of grammars themselves, or I mean, the history of Anglo-Saxon scholarship, goes a long way as well. So I would imagine, but I'm not too well versed on that. But yeah, kind of forgot my original point.
It's easy to do when you're talking about stuff like this. You just follow the rabbit along, go down the rabbit hole.
That's what I can't believe I'm saying this. 9 years ago or so.
Wow.
Yeah, 9 years ago, I started this channel in 2014, and it's only I realized, like getting into this stuff, it's more than just a language. It's history. It's the people I also got associated with, and learned so many things, and it's just gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's just, but it's all fascinating nonetheless. And I'm so happy that there are people all around the world, such as yourself, that actually appreciate this stuff. It's like, it's wonderful. Yeah.
It really is. Next year, you're going to have to get a cake. 10 years, a decade. You'll have to do it up.
Yeah, you know what I thought of doing? I thought of like having like a compilation of like all the previous times I've celebrated like my milestones, and like
yeah,
something like that. We'll see what happens. I mean, that would be wonderful. And you've been doing your channel for what, 5 years, right?
5, yeah.
Yeah. it's good stuff. Yeah, it's just the thing is with doing what we're doing, you just don't give up, and like,
Yeah,
there are times where it's not easy, but it's okay to put this on the side, resume to it later, and then and it's just and those that are sincere, they'll stick around.
that's the truth. You'll find your audience. After 5 years, 9 years, this is like a massive part of your life. So it's a big part of how you spend your time.
Of course, it's and we're so blessed to live in a time where we have all these interests, and we can share them with the world, and I'm so glad that our interests overlap and we can have this conversation. It's yeah, given your fondness of Alfred, and I mean, I like Alfred too. I mean, I'm not really a fan of his laws here and there, but at the same time, I have to be honest with myself and honest with the fact that, I mean, if it wasn't for Alfred, we would have how can I word this? It's because of Alfred we have more literature, right?
Yeah.
We have more things, more source material to study from, and it's because the thing is, Old English. Just to make a comparison to Latin in the modern day, that Latin, from what I observe, it is pretty much a functional language, whereas in Old English, you have to. It's not. There are things where, like, yeah, you can talk about higher things, but if you're to ask me, okay, Kevin, what's triangle in Old English?
Yeah.
I'll be like, well, I would have to repurpose that adjective to mean this. So I would have to do a lot of reworking, because I mean it's incomplete, but there's enough of it out there to make innovations and this and that. Should one want to use it today for whatever reason, and whether it's probably just for fun or what have you. But here we are. Okay. So, any last words on anything Anglo-Saxon, King Alfred, or anything like that before we wrap up? Or
I just want to say I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot from you. I wanted to be taking notes. I'm proud of myself that I didn't, but I had my notebook out to write down what you had to say.
I'm very flattered. But I can always repeat this stuff. I'll be
That's
more than
We
happy.
spoiled future videos, so we just need to wait for the future videos.
Yeah, of course. I'd be happy to do this again.
Me too.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll discuss the next time when we can do this. And okay, fantastic.
Yes.
Okay.
And you can come on my channel and we can talk about Anglo-Saxon books.
Fantastic. After this, I do have an idea to share with you. I don't want to spoil it here live recorded on YouTube, but there's an idea I'd like to go over with you on your channel.
Good.
And, yeah. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and really thank you, Jennifer, for being here with me. You're essentially my first guest proper with Steam Labs officially and whatnot. I just can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was great, Kevin.
Fantastic. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. And if you really like the channel, please subscribe. And if you really like the channel, you can also be a patron. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. See ya.